Norway from Vikings to welfare. Shocking rise, my name doesn't matter. What matters is that my family has lived on this same stretch of Norwegian coastline for more generations than anyone can count. And the story of this country is really a story of constant reinvention. Stay with me, because Norway went from feared raiders to a poor and overlooked corner of Europe, to one of the wealthiest, most stable nations on Earth, and almost none of it happened the way you'd expect. Long before anyone called this place Norway, in the way we mean it today. Our ancestors were known across Europe for one thing above all else: the longship. These weren't just war vessels. They were built shallow enough to cross open ocean and still slide up a riverbank, which meant raiders could appear almost anywhere with little warning, striking a monastery or a coastal town and disappearing again before any organized defense could respond. The ships themselves were marvels of design for their time. Flexible wooden hulls that could bend with the waves instead of breaking against them, and a single mast that could be raised or lowered, depending on whether the wind or the oars were doing the work that day. For roughly 3 centuries, Norse sailors raided, traded, and settled across huge stretches of Europe, reaching as far as the British Isles, parts of France, and eventually even crossing the North Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland, with some sailing on to the edge of North America centuries before anyone else from Europe arrived there. Entire Norwegian farming communities packed up and resettled in places like the Scottish Islands, parts of Ireland, and eventually Iceland, bringing their language, their laws, and their way of life with them. Some of those settlements lasted for centuries, blending with local populations until the line between settler and native became almost impossible to draw. But raiding was never the whole story, even back then. Norse traders moved furs, walrus ivory, and timber south in exchange for silver and goods most of Europe didn't even know existed yet. Norwegian chieftains grew wealthy not just from plunder, but from controlling trade routes along the coast, charging tolls, brokering deals, and building the first real concentrations of power and land that this region had ever seen. The image of the Viking as purely a warrior misses just how much of this era was built on trade routes, settlement, and slow, patient expansion rather than constant violence. 230 that era eventually faded, not through some single dramatic defeat, but through a slower shift toward Christianity, centralized kingship, and the same kind of feudal structures spreading across the rest of Europe. Missionaries and kings worked hand in hand, often forcibly, to replace the old gods with the new religion, and the scattered farming communities and local chieftains, who had once ruled their own small territories, gradually answered to a single crown instead. Norway became a unified kingdom, but a poor and thinly populated one, clinging to a rugged coastline with little farmland and a climate that made every harvest a gamble. Mountains and fjords that look beautiful to a modern traveler made farming nearly impossible across most of the country, and fishing, not agriculture, became the thing that kept most coastal families alive. Then came centuries that most people outside Norway know almost nothing about. A devastating wave of plague in the mid-1300s wiped out a huge share of the population, weakening the kingdom so badly that it could no longer stand fully on its own. Norway entered a long union first with Denmark, and later with Sweden, periods where Norwegian identity persisted, but Norwegian independence largely didn't. For roughly 400 years under Danish rule, decisions about Norway were often made from Copenhagen, not from anywhere inside the country itself. Norwegian was pushed aside as the language of administration and education. The old parliament lost most of its real power, and Norway functioned, for all practical purposes, as a province rather than a kingdom in its own right. Many Norwegians at the time would have told you their nation existed more as a memory than as a government. 14 by the early 1800s, that started to shift. As the old Danish-Norwegian Union collapsed amid the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, Norway briefly tasted independence, wrote its own constitution, and then almost immediately found itself forced into a new union. This time with Sweden. It wasn't full independence, but it was more self-governance than Norway had held in centuries, including its own constitution, its own parliament, and control over most domestic affairs. For nearly a century under that Swedish union, Norway quietly built the institutions of a modern state almost in practice mode: a working parliament, an independent legal system, growing literacy, and a fishing and shipping economy that, while far from wealthy, was self-reliant in a way that mattered enormously later. Norwegian merchant ships became a common sight in ports across the world, and a generation of engineers and skilled tradesmen grew up learning industries that would matter far more than anyone realized at the time. By the end of the 1800s, a wave of national pride, fueled by everything from folk music collection to polar exploration that put Norwegian names on the world map, was pushing the country toward a question it could no longer avoid. Should it finally stand entirely on its own? Norwegian explorers raced to reach the South Pole and crossed Arctic ice in ways that made headlines across Europe, giving ordinary Norwegians something rare: a sense that their small country could still do something the rest of the world noticed. 550 in 1905, that question was finally answered. Through a national vote and tense negotiation rather than war, Norway peacefully separated from Sweden and became a fully independent kingdom for the first time in nearly 500 years. I think this is the part of Norway's story that surprises people most. There was no revolution, no dramatic battle for independence the way other nations tell their founding stories. It was negotiated, voted on, and settled with remarkably little bloodshed, a pattern of careful, consensus-driven decision-making that would show up again and again in Norway's history. The newly independent country was still poor by European standards. Fishing, shipping, and timber were the backbone of the economy, and a significant share of Norwegians immigrated abroad, especially to North America, simply because there wasn't enough opportunity at home. Nobody in this newly independent, modest little kingdom could have imagined what was coming. The 20th century brought hardship most Norwegians don't enjoy discussing in any detail. Norway tried to stay neutral as the rest of Europe slid toward war, just as it had in the First World War. But in the spring of 1940 it was invaded and occupied for 5 years. The royal family and government fled the country rather than surrender, continuing to operate in exile, while resistance networks formed quietly back home, smuggling intelligence, sabotaging infrastructure the occupying forces depended on, and helping people escape across the border whenever they could. Rationing, censorship, and constant surveillance became part of daily life, and an entire generation grew up never having known their country as anything but occupied territory before liberation finally came in 1945. That experience left a deep mark on how Norway approached its own security and independence in the decades that followed, including a firm decision afterward to never again rely solely on neutrality for protection. After the war, Norway rebuilt rapidly, embracing the kind of expanded social welfare system that was spreading across much of Northern Europe at the time. Public health care, expanded pensions, strong labor protections, and a genuine push toward economic equality. This wasn't unique to Norway; its neighbors were building similar systems. What made Norway's version eventually so remarkable wasn't the idea behind it. It was what happened next, almost by accident. In the late 1960s, after years of disappointing exploration in the North Sea, a well finally struck a massive oil and gas field beneath Norwegian waters on Christmas Eve, after geologists had spent years telling the government not to expect much from these particular waters at all. The discovery could easily have gone the way it did in many other resource-rich nations. Fast wealth concentrated among a few, followed by instability once the resource ran low or prices crashed. Norway made a different choice, and it's the choice that defines the country today more than almost anything else. Rather than simply spending the new oil revenue, the government insisted on heavy state involvement in the industry from the very beginning, taxed it aggressively, built a state-owned oil company to make sure Norwegians themselves controlled a meaningful share of the resource rather than handing it entirely to foreign companies, and eventually created a sovereign wealth fund specifically designed to save and invest the profits for future generations rather than the present one. That fund grew, year after year, until it became one of the largest investment funds on the entire planet, holding stakes in thousands of companies across nearly every country in the world. A relatively small, historically poor nation suddenly held financial influence completely disproportionate to its population, all while maintaining a strict rule that only a small percentage of the fund's returns could be spent in any given year, protecting it from the kind of political pressure that has drained similar funds elsewhere. That decision, made deliberately rather than left to chance, is really the hinge point of this whole story. The oil money didn't just sit in a vault. It helped fund an already strong welfare system, free healthcare, free university education, generous parental leave, and one of the lowest poverty rates anywhere in the world at the same time. Careful management meant the economy didn't become entirely dependent on oil prices the way some other producing nations did. When oil prices crashed, Norway didn't collapse with them, because the wealth fund had already spread that risk across the entire global economy, rather than keeping it all tied to one resource in one country. Today, the same coastline where longships once launched raids on distant shores is lined with offshore platforms, hydroelectric dams, and some of the highest living standards anywhere on Earth. The fjords that once hid small fishing villages now host both fishing fleets and cruise ships, the same waters serving completely different economies generations apart. Looking back across all of it, what strikes me most isn't any single turning point. It's how consistently Norway chose negotiation over conflict, patience over speed, and collective benefit over individual gain again and again, across centuries that could easily have gone differently. The independence movement could have turned violent. The oil discovery could have been squandered the way it was elsewhere. Neither outcome was guaranteed. Both were choices made by people who had no certainty about how things would turn out, from feared raiders to a quiet kingdom under foreign rule, to a peaceful and almost unnoticed independence, to one of the most stable and prosperous societies on the planet. Norway's rise wasn't really sudden at all. It just looks that way from the outside, compressed into a single shocking story instead of the slow, deliberate climb it actually was. That's the real story of Norway's progress. If you want to see how Norway's neighbors, Sweden and Denmark, built their own versions of this same Nordic model, let me know in the comments, and I'll take you there next.